The forest stood still, cloaked in an eerie mist that seemed to swallow sound, light, and life itself. Thick, ancient trees with gnarled roots reached toward the heavens, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. This was no ordinary forest, no place one would stumble upon by chance. It was a land untouched by modernity, a realm that the world had forgotten, hidden deep within the heart of Europe. For centuries, whispers had floated through local villages, tales of a forgotten civilization lost to time, its legacy buried beneath layers of earth and stone. Yet it wasn't until now that anyone dared to uncover the truth. The team of archaeologists had trekked for days, through thick brambles and jagged rocks, all the while guided only by old fragmented maps and half-forgotten legends. Their journey had been perilous and their hopes were frail. But in their hearts burned the promise of discovery, the chance to uncover a long-lost relic of a civilization that had vanished without a trace. Professor William Grant, the leader of the expedition, was the first to spot it. The entrance. It was nothing more than a dark crack in the earth, hidden behind a cluster of ancient stones draped in moss and vines. With a combination of awe and trepidation, they cleared the area, revealing an opening that led down into the earth. An oppressive, unnatural silence seemed to greet them as they descended, as if the world above had turned its back on what lay below. The walls of the tomb were slick with moisture, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten history. The passageway led them deep into the bowels of the earth, where the faint glow of their torches flickered on the edges of intricate carvings, symbols that none of them recognized, strange and alien, yet deeply familiar in a way that unsettled their very souls. "Look at this," said Clara, one of the younger archaeologists, her voice a hushed whisper as she traced her fingers over the carvings. This is something from a civilization no one has ever written about." Grant nodded grimly. A civilization that might have vanished for a reason. They reached a large chamber, and the moment they entered, the air seemed to thicken as if they were no longer alone. There, in the center of the room, stood a set of statues, stone figures each carved with painstaking detail. Their eyes were wide, their expressions frozen in a perpetual scream, their hands twisted in strange, grotesque poses. The statues seemed to vibrate with an energy that unsettled the team. Their forms were unlike anything the archaeologists had ever encountered, disturbing and unnatural. Each statue bore markings that appeared to move, the symbols shifting as if alive. And at the center of the room, raised upon a stone pedestal, stood the largest statue, a towering figure whose face was obscured by a dark hood, its eyes glowing faintly red. "What in God's name are these?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. She took a step forward, her curiosity growing stronger than her fear. "Do not touch them," Grant warned, his voice hoarse. But it was too late. Clara's fingers brushed against the stone of the nearest statue, and in that instant the temperature in the room dropped. A chill crept up her spine and she recoiled, but the damage had been done. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to moan in response. Suddenly the statues began to move. Not all at once, but slowly, as if coming to life after millennia of slumber. The stone figures shifted, their eyes opening wide, glowing with an unnatural light. Clara gasped, stepping back, but it was too late. The statues were not just sculptures, they were sentinels. And they were alive. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, and the statues began to advance, their stone feet grinding against the ancient floor. But it wasn't just their movement that terrified the team, it was the whispers that followed. In a language none of them could understand, the statues seemed to be speaking, their mouths opening, their voices rising in a chorus of forgotten words. The air around them grew thick with an oppressive force, as though the very walls of the tomb were closing in. The whispers became louder, more frantic, and the temperature dropped to freezing. The team huddled together, eyes wide with terror. "What is happening?" Clara gasped, her voice trembling with fear. "They're cursed," Grant muttered, his face pale. "These statues were made to guard something horrible. We've awoken it." Suddenly, the ground shook violently, and a deafening sound filled the chamber, as though something deep within the earth had cracked open. From the shadows at the far end of the chamber, a dark, twisted shape began to emerge. A figure cloaked in darkness, its form shifting and warping as though it was never truly of this world. It was a creature from another time, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The very air around it seemed to warp and bend, as if reality itself were buckling under its presence. The team could feel the weight of its power, an ancient force that had been imprisoned for millennia. They had uncovered something that should have never been touched. A god of destruction, a being from beyond the known world. "Run!" Grant shouted, but it was too late. The statues advanced, and the creature in the shadows let out a chilling roar. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls closing in, the ground splitting open. The archaeologists had stumbled upon the greatest discovery of their lives, but they had also awakened something far darker than they could ever have imagined. And now they were trapped, ensnared in the very thing they had come to uncover. As the last flickers of light from their torches sputtered out, the creature's voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in that ancient language, a language that held the promise of doom. It was clear now, the legends were true. The tomb was a prison, and the thing they had released was no god. It was an ancient evil, one that had been sealed away in blood and death, and now it was free. And there would be no escaping it. The silence that followed the creature's roar was suffocating. It wrapped around the team like a cold shroud, pressing in from all sides, stealing the breath from their lungs. Their hearts pounded in their chests, but the air seemed to have turned to ice, suffocating their very will to move. For a moment, no one dared to speak. No one dared to even breathe. The statues, once so still and lifeless, had begun to close in on them. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like clockwork figures that had not been wound for centuries. Their glowing eyes followed every twitch, every desperate movement the team made. The whispers from the statues had become a constant hum in the background, now amplified in their terror. The words were garbled, twisted, and incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear. They were not meant to be there. Clara was the first to break the silence. She had been standing frozen in place, her wide eyes staring at the towering figure that loomed in the shadows. A sense of overwhelming dread filled her, her body trembling uncontrollably. The creature's form was shifting, distorting as if it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its massive black wings fluttered in the shadows, but the wings were not feathers. They were something else, tattered and writhing like veins, stretching, growing, and pulling at the fabric of reality itself. "William, we have to get out," Clara whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling with fear. Grant, too, stood paralyzed. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The others were frozen in terror, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. They had all made a grave mistake, awakening something older than the earth itself, something that had been buried beneath the stone for millennia. But now it was awake and it was hungry. The creature's voice, if it could even be called a voice, slithered through the air like 1,000 insects crawling under the skin. It was the sound of something ancient, a tone that could shatter the sanity of anyone who heard it. And yet, it was a language they could almost understand, as if the meaning was buried deep within their very souls. Free, at last. The walls seemed to groan and the floor beneath them cracked. The temperature had dropped even further, and now the very ground seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. "We're trapped," muttered Michael, the team's historian, his voice tinged with hysteria. "This place, it's not just a tomb, it's a prison. A prison for something evil. We have to stop it. We have to." Grant's eyes snapped toward the stone pedestal at the center of the chamber. The giant statue was staring down at them now, its glowing eyes like twin pools of blood, radiating malice. It was the one statue that had been different from all the others, the one that had been perched above the rest like a dark god watching over its minions. He could feel it, the power it exuded, the force of a being that had been sealed away with blood and death. "They were trying to keep it in," Grant said, his voice low. "This was no temple. It's a prison. These statues, they're the seals. They were designed to hold it back. And we—" Suddenly there was a loud crack, followed by a deep rumbling noise that seemed to shake the very foundation of the tomb. The ground shuddered, and the stone floor split open with a deafening crack. A cold gust of wind rushed through the chamber, carrying with it the stench of decay, of something long dead and buried. From the depths of the new chasm, dark tendrils began to rise. Slithering, coiling, they reached up like the fingers of a drowned corpse, pulling themselves into the light. "No. We have to leave now," shouted Clara, her voice breaking. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The darkness had already claimed them. The creature in the shadows roared again, but this time the sound was different. It was not just a roar. It was a scream of exultation, a triumphant cry that seemed to shake the very fabric of time and space. The air around them grew thick, charged with static, and the temperature plunged even further. Grant could feel his breath turning to fog, his limbs growing numb. He had to think. They had to do something. Anything. "Get to the pedestal," Grant shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. "The statue, the pedestal, there has to be a way to seal it back." But as they moved toward the center, the statues began to shift again. They were no longer merely statues. They were the guardians of this prison. They stepped down from their places, their stone feet scraping across the floor with terrifying speed, moving toward the team with a purpose. Clara screamed as one of the statues, a twisted figure with a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth, reached out and grabbed her arm with a force that nearly tore her shoulder from its socket. The stone fingers dug into her flesh, and the world around her seemed to bend as if reality itself were being warped. "Clara!" Michael shouted, lunging forward. But as he reached her, the ground split open beneath his feet, and he fell into the abyss with a cry that echoed through the tomb. "No!" Grant screamed. He grabbed Clara by the waist, pulling her away from the grasp of the statue. But it was too late. Her eyes had already glazed over, and a dark shadow began to coil around her body, as if the statue's touch had stolen her very soul. "She's gone," said Robert, the team's geologist, his voice hollow. "We can't fight this thing. We have to." Another statue advanced, its stone hands reaching out. This one had the body of a man, but the head of a bird, an eagle with eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. Its beak opened wide, releasing a terrible screech that rattled the bones of everyone present. "Get back!" Grant shouted, swinging his pickaxe toward the statue, but it was useless. The stone was unyielding, and the creature it represented was unstoppable. He looked back toward the pedestal. The energy in the room was rising, the dark tendrils from the cracks in the ground pulling up to the surface, and the creature was coming closer. Desperation seized him. He had to stop this. They all had to stop this, or they would die here, trapped in an ancient hell that none of them could have possibly understood. He glanced at the statues. Their eyes were glowing brighter now, pulsing in sync with the growing power of the thing beneath them. They were the key. Somehow they were the key to stopping it. Suddenly, Clara's body spasmed violently, and her mouth opened wide, releasing a horrific scream. Her voice was no longer her own, it was the voice of something ancient and terrible. She staggered backward, her eyes wide, but they were not her eyes. They were empty black voids. "Clara!" Grant shouted, but it was too late. The curse had taken her. The whispers of the statues grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of madness. The ground trembled beneath them and the darkness pressed in from all sides. The creature was no longer in the shadows, it was here, in the room with them, its presence filling the air with despair. Grant's heart pounded as he realized the terrible truth. The creature wasn't simply trying to escape, it was already here. And they had no way of stopping it. With one final gut-wrenching scream, the darkness exploded outward, and the tomb's ancient prison was broken wide open. The room exploded with a deafening roar, the air itself warping as if the very fabric of reality were being torn apart. Dust and stone rained down from the ceiling as the chasm beneath their feet widened, opening to an abyss so deep it seemed to stretch into eternity. The very ground beneath their feet trembled as though the earth itself was recoiling in fear. The statues, once mere figures of stone, had come to life, each moving with terrifying precision, their eyes glowing brighter, their stone limbs creaking like ancient machinery. Grant's heart raced as he pulled Clara's limp, lifeless form away from the monstrous grasp of the statue. The sight of her once vibrant eyes now empty and black sent a chill of dread through his bones. She was gone. The thing inside her was no longer human, it had consumed her body and soul. And now it was coming for them all. "Run!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic, but it was already too late. The ground beneath them gave way as another massive figure stepped forward, this one with the head of a lion and the body of a twisted serpent. It moved with unnatural speed, its eyes fixated on Grant, and the ground shuddered beneath its weight. The sound of footsteps, no, of slithering, echoed through the chamber, reverberating in the darkness. The other statues too were advancing now. One of them, a grotesque figure with the body of a man and the wings of a bat, flapped its wings, sending gusts of icy wind into their faces. The air thickened with an overwhelming sense of malevolent power, a presence so ancient and dark that it suffocated everything in its path. Grant stumbled backward, his legs weak from terror. "We have to," his words were cut off by a piercing scream from Michael. Michael was falling, his body dragged into the chasm by unseen hands. His eyes locked with Grant's for a split second, his expression filled with horror and helplessness, before he vanished into the darkness below. "No!" Grant screamed, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of the statue's growls and the howling wind. Beside him, Robert was frozen, his eyes wide in disbelief. This can't be real. This isn't happening." But it was happening. It was all happening. "We have to get out," Grant forced through gritted teeth, his mind spinning. "Now. There has to be another way out of here." But as if in response to his words, the ground began to shake again, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The stone beneath their feet groaned as cracks spread across the room like spider webs. They were trapped. There was no way out. Another figure stepped forward from the shadows. This one was unlike the others. Taller, darker, and far more terrifying, it stood at the far end of the chamber watching them with cold, malevolent eyes. Its face was obscured by a veil of shadows, but Grant could feel its gaze burning through him. This was the one that had been imprisoned here for eons, the one the statues had been built to contain. The one they had freed. The figure raised its hand and a sharp, unnatural sound filled the air, the sound of 1,000 voices whispering in unison, each one more agonizing than the last. They were whispers of souls long lost to time, trapped in an endless void, their suffering endless. The darkness around them deepened, pressing in on them from every direction. It spoke. Its voice was not one voice but many, a chorus of tortured souls echoing in the vast empty void. You have released me, and now you will serve. The words reverberated in Grant's mind, sending a wave of nausea through him. His body was paralyzed by fear, unable to move. His thoughts raced, but they were clouded, as if something was pressing against his mind, forcing him to surrender to the darkness. The statues were closing in around them, their stone feet scraping against the ground like the march of inevitability. Each step was a death sentence. We're going to die here, Robert whispered, his voice hollow. His eyes were wide with terror, and his whole body trembled, as though he was being crushed by the weight of the curse that had been unleashed. This is the end. This is how it ends. Grant's breath quickened. They couldn't give up. He refused to let this be the end. But as he looked around at the darkness that surrounded them, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The tomb was alive with malevolent energy. The walls, the statues, the very air seemed to be pulsing with the presence of the creature they had freed. Clara's body was no longer in his arms. He turned in horror to see her figure moving slowly toward the towering figure in the shadows, her eyes still empty and dark. The creature inside her was calling to her, pulling her toward it, like a moth to a flame. No! Grant screamed, his voice hoarse. He lunged forward to stop her, but his hands passed right through her. She was no longer truly there, but a vessel for the thing that now controlled her. The figure in the shadows extended a hand, and with it, the air around them grew colder. The temperature plummeted further, and the very walls of the chamber seemed to crumble away, revealing glimpses of a world beyond, an abyss that stretched on forever, a world filled with twisting shadows and endless pain. Robert was the next to fall. He staggered forward, his eyes wide, his hands outstretched as if reaching for something just out of his grasp. A shadowy tendril reached out from the figure's hand and wrapped around Robert's throat. With a snap, the tendril tightened, pulling him into the darkness. Grant felt the presence of the creature shift, its attention now fully focused on him. It was coming for him. In his panic, Grant stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the room had become a labyrinth of darkness. The statues were closing in, their movements deliberate, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. The very ground seemed to shift, each step he took dragging him deeper into the nightmare. Suddenly, something in his mind clicked. The pedestal, the statues, the tomb. They were all connected. This was no mere tomb, it was a seal, a lock that kept the creature imprisoned, and the statues were the keys. But how could he reverse it? How could he stop the creature now that it was free? Grant's eyes locked onto the pedestal at the center of the room, its surface now slick with an unnatural dark ichor. The power of the creature pulsed through the chamber, twisting the very fabric of reality around him. His legs moved of their own accord, his body acting on a primal instinct he didn't fully understand. He had to do something. He had to close the seal. But before he could reach the pedestal, the statues advanced once more. This time they were not silent. They howled, their voices filling the air with a cacophony of madness. Each one was a manifestation of the creature's will. Every step they took was another strike against his sanity. The shadows that filled the room began to warp and shift, and the ground beneath him cracked open once more. This time there was no escape. Only the dark and the thing that now roamed the earth free of its chains. Grant's mind reeled, and his breath caught in his throat as the thing moved toward him, its shape ever-shifting, ever-changing. And in that moment he realized the truth. The creature was not simply a monster. It was an ancient force, an entity older than time itself. And now it was hungry. For him. And for everything. The air was thick with a suffocating ancient power, so overwhelming that Grant could barely breathe. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, but his body felt rooted to the ground, trapped in the pull of the creature's presence. His pulse raced, drowning out the sounds of the statues, the whispers, the echoes of tormented souls. His mind was a storm of confusion, terror, and instinctive knowledge that there was no escaping this place. The creature in the shadows, that towering presence of nightmare, drew closer. Each step it took seemed to distort the space around it, bending reality itself. The whispers in the air grew louder, maddening, echoing through his skull. The voices of the damned reached out, their words unintelligible, a cacophony of pain and despair. It was as if time itself had stopped. There was no forward or backward, only this moment stretching out into eternity. The walls of the tomb seemed to close in, the ground beneath him shifting, moving like a living thing as though it were no longer a part of this world. Then the creature spoke. Its voice was not a voice at all but an overwhelming force of will, pouring into Grant's mind like a torrent of ice-cold water. It was a whisper, a command, a promise. You cannot run from what has been set into motion. The words slithered into his mind, digging into the deepest corners of his thoughts. They weren't just words, they were truths. In that instant, Grant understood that the creature was not simply a being of power. It was the beginning of an ancient cycle, a force that had existed long before humanity, and would continue to exist long after it was gone. It was not just an entity, it was the end, the destruction of all things. And it had been waiting, sleeping for eons. Grant's legs moved again, but this time there was no fear. There was only a cold, calculating resolve that settled in the pit of his stomach. He would not die here. Not like this. He stumbled forward, almost in a trance, his thoughts spinning. The pedestal. The statues. He had to stop it. But how? A sharp crack of stone echoed in the cavernous chamber. He turned to see the massive stone figure with the bat wings, its wings now unfurled, moved toward him with unnatural grace. Its eyes, now glowing with an inner fire, locked onto him, its mouth twisting into a grotesque semblance of a grin. You think you can stop this? You are a mere mortal, it whispered in a voice that made Grant's blood run cold. But before it could reach him, something happened. A faint, distant hum filled the air, soft at first, then growing louder, sharper. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. The ground shuddered again, but this time, it wasn't the creature's power that caused the tremor, it was something else. The statues froze. The whispers stopped. And for a brief moment the air seemed to clear, the oppressive pressure lifting just enough for Grant to think clearly. He gasped for air, his head spinning with the realization that something was happening beyond his control. And then he saw it. The pedestal, the source of the tomb's power, was glowing. A faint, pulsing light emanated from its cracks, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the walls. It was calling to him. He stumbled forward, propelled by something beyond fear. The creature's dark presence loomed behind him, but its power had been momentarily interrupted, its connection to the tomb severed or at least weakened. As he reached the pedestal, his trembling hands touched the surface. The stone was warm to the touch, as though it had a pulse of its own, beating with the rhythm of something ancient, something primal. The glow intensified, and the walls began to vibrate, groaning as if the entire tomb was awakening from a deep slumber. And then he understood. The tomb was not a prison, it was a trap. A trap set by the very civilization that had created these statues, these guardians. They had known this day would come, the day when the creature would awaken. The statues, the mummified remains, the strange hieroglyphs on the walls, they were all warnings, symbols designed to seal away the entity. But now the seal was broken. The creature was free. Grant closed his eyes, his hands clenching around the pedestal. He could feel the energy surging through him, flowing from the stone into his very soul. It was too much. The power of the creature, the curse of the tomb, it was coursing through him like fire. The light from the pedestal flared brighter, blinding him for a moment, and when it faded, he saw something he could barely comprehend. The walls had shifted. The floor was no longer the same. The tomb was not just a tomb, it was a gateway. The creature was not alone. Behind it, a dark, swirling void stretched out before him, a chasm leading into a place beyond time and space. A place where reality itself broke down. And in the distance he could see shapes, figures. Some were humanoid, others monstrous, their forms twisting and changing in the blackness. They were coming. Grant could hear them now. The whispers of the souls trapped in the abyss, their voices a chorus of anguish crying for release. The very fabric of reality around him began to warp, as if the tomb itself was folding into another dimension, breaking down the barriers between worlds. He was no longer just facing the creature. The tomb was opening the door. You have freed me, the creature's voice echoed in his mind, its power now overwhelming, suffocating him in its weight. Now you will join me. All of you will join me as the worlds collapse. The ground cracked beneath him. He looked down and saw the cracks spreading, like veins of some ancient, cursed life form. The end was coming. And there was no escape. Grant's heart raced in his chest, the very rhythm of it seeming to vibrate with the quaking of the tomb. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls, once solid and imposing, now rippled as though made of water. The creature, that looming nightmare of darkness and ancient malevolence, towered behind him, its presence suffocating, pressing down like a weight that threatened to crush his very soul. The ground cracked again, and this time the cracks spread faster, wider, as if the tomb itself was coming apart at the seams. The voices of the trapped souls, the whispers of the damned, grew louder, their tortured cries a cacophony that rattled the very bones of the earth. Grant's fingers tightened around the pedestal, the stone pulsing beneath his touch, but it wasn't enough. The power radiating from it was wild, untamed, thrumming through him with such intensity that his body couldn't withstand it. He felt his mind begin to fray, the edges of his consciousness starting to unravel as the void behind him grew wider, darker. They were coming. Not just the creature but everything that had been sealed away in the forgotten corners of time, monsters, phantoms, gods, and horrors that had once walked the earth in ages long past. The door between the worlds had been opened and it was pulling him in. But there was still something holding him back. Through the haze of panic, Grant could see the others, scattered across the tomb, their faces pale and strained with terror. Jacob was nearest, his face twisted in disbelief as he stared at the expanding rift in the air. His eyes, wide with fear, met Grant's, and for a brief moment the world seemed to freeze. "Grant!" Jacob's voice was hoarse, desperate. "We need to get out of here. Now." But the ground trembled once more and a deafening roar split the air. A gust of foul wind blew through the tomb, scattering dust and debris in every direction, and in that moment, Grant understood with sickening clarity that escape was no longer an option. The statues, those lifeless guardians that had once stood frozen in time, had come to life. Their stone forms now moved with unnatural fluidity, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, their bodies shifting and twisting as though they were more than mere stone. They advanced toward the group, their movements predatory, their arms outstretched, seeking to seize their souls. Grant could feel the pull of their gaze, cold, calculating, and it was only a matter of time before one of them reached him. "We're running out of time," Jacob shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He glanced over at the others, but the words were lost in the chaos. The tomb was no longer a place of stone and dust. It was a living thing, breathing and pulsing with dark energy. The walls, once cold and unyielding, now seemed to throb, as though the entire structure was alive, infected by the curse of the creature that had been trapped here for millennia. Grant's breath came in ragged gasps as he tore his eyes away from the statues and turned toward the others. He saw Lara and Isaac struggling to make sense of what was happening, their faces pale with terror. The rift in the air was widening, the darkness spilling out like ink, pouring into the tomb from some unknown, distant abyss. And that's when it hit him. It wasn't just the tomb that was collapsing, it was everything. Time, space, reality, it was all starting to fold in on itself. They were no longer in control. The boundaries between worlds were being erased. Grant's mind raced, his thoughts frantic, trying to find some way, some means of stopping this. But there was nothing. The pedestal was a conduit, feeding the tomb's power, and the creature, the entity that had been sealed away for centuries, was the key. Every moment they spent here, every second they delayed, they were drawing closer to the point of no return. The tomb would not just collapse, it would pull the entire world into its endless void. But there had to be something. Something he could do. And then, through the din of chaos, he heard it, a whisper. Not from the creature, not from the tomb, but from something older, something that felt distant. A voice that cut through the madness, speaking directly to his soul. The seal is broken. The key is lost. But the balance can still be restored. Grant's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the voice, searching the darkness, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows and the growing void. And then he realized. The pedestal, the stone, the key. The pedestal wasn't just a source of power. It was a part of the original seal, a conduit that had been crafted by the ancient civilization to keep the creature imprisoned. But now that the creature was free, the pedestal had become the catalyst for everything to unravel. It was the balance, the force that had kept everything in place. And now, it was the thing that would either save or destroy them all. Grant reached out, his hands trembling, and placed his palm flat against the glowing surface. The stone burned, searing his skin with an unbearable heat, but he couldn't pull away. The power of the tomb surged through him again, stronger this time, trying to tear him apart, to drag him into the abyss. "You will not succeed." The creature's voice was a venomous hiss, and as the darkness spread, the world around Grant began to unravel. The statues were closing in, their stone limbs reaching for him, and Jacob was shouting, struggling against the pull of the collapsing tomb. But Grant's mind was focused. There was something he had to do. The balance must be restored. His fingers dug into the pedestal, and with an explosion of light, the stone cracked open, revealing the ancient symbols beneath. They glowed with a pulsating energy, and in that instant, everything changed. The walls of the tomb trembled violently, and the statues froze. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing an endless chasm, an abyss where time and space ceased to exist. And in that void Grant saw it. The creature. It was no longer a shadow. It was real, a dark, shifting mass of pure malevolence. Its form was constantly changing, flickering between states, human, animal, godlike, and monstrous all at once. It was the nothing that would consume everything. And then, with a deafening roar, the creature lunged. But this time it wasn't just Grant who stood against it. The others, Jacob, Lara, Isaac, had gathered around him, their resolve hardening in the face of the nightmare they had unleashed. Together they reached for the pedestal, each of them adding their strength to the overwhelming power that surged through the tomb. The creature howled in fury, its shape distorting as the tomb began to collapse completely, the rift between worlds widening. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume them all, Grant felt the pull. The tomb, the pedestal, the creature, it all collapsed into one final, terrifying void. The world disappeared. The world was silent. The chaos, the screams, the terrible weight of the tomb, all of it had vanished. Grant's mind was numb, his body weak, as though he had been torn apart and stitched back together. There was no longer the oppressive darkness, no more quaking earth, no statues reaching for them. Only an eerie stillness remained, as though time itself had stopped. He opened his eyes. At first he thought it was a dream. A final vision before his mind gave way, a moment of calm before the darkness took him completely. But when he sat up, his eyes adjusting to the dim light around him, he realized that he was no longer in the tomb. He was outside. The sky above was a pale gray, as if the storm had passed but had left its mark on everything. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of earth and rain lingering. The familiar rustling of leaves in the wind made it feel like they had returned to the forest. But the forest was empty, peaceful, untouched by the horrors they had just witnessed. Around him, Jacob, Lara, and Isaac were standing, looking equally bewildered, their faces pale, their clothes torn, but they were alive. They looked at each other, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief, and then their gazes turned to Grant. "Is this real?" Jacob asked, his voice hoarse. Grant didn't know how to answer. Was it real? Was this a reward for their survival, or were they trapped in some strange liminal place where time and space had no meaning? The tomb, the statues, the dark creature. They felt like distant memories, like echoes from a nightmare that never truly existed. "I think we're free," Lara said, her voice trembling. She glanced around at the vast, empty forest and then back to the others. But what happened to the creature? What happened to the tomb? Grant didn't have an answer. The only thing he could feel was a strange sense of weightlessness, as if the world they had known, filled with the curse and terror, had fallen away, leaving only this quiet, uncertain peace. Isaac, ever the skeptic, frowned. "We can't just stand here. We need to find a way out of this place." But Grant wasn't sure they were ever going to find a way out. This wasn't the world they knew. It was something else, something between worlds, a place where the lines between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition. As he stood up, the ground beneath them trembled just slightly, as though the world was still shifting. A faint hum filled the air, and the trees seemed to bend inwards, their shadows stretching long and dark. The silence was thick, unsettling. And then it came, a whisper so faint that Grant almost thought it was his imagination. "The past is never gone. It waits, it lingers in places forgotten by time." Grant turned sharply, looking at the others. They had all heard it too. But there was no one else around. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere, echoing in their minds, twisting their sense of reality even further. For a moment, Grant thought he saw something in the distance, figures, just shadows in the mist. But as quickly as they appeared, they disappeared, as though they had never been there at all. He blinked, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. Had they truly escaped the horrors of the tomb? Or had they simply entered another phase of their torment? "You're free," the voice whispered again, clearer this time, though it was still distant, fading with the wind. "But remember, the seals were never meant to last forever." Grant felt a chill run down his spine. The creature, the statues, the ancient curse, it was all too real. But now, it seemed to be fading, becoming something that belonged to a far-off memory, a nightmare that would never truly end. Lara reached out, her hand touching Grant's arm, grounding him. "We made it out, Grant. We have to believe that." She was right. They had made it out. But the feeling of something unfinished gnawed at him. The past, the curse, had not been destroyed. It had only been pushed back, held at bay for a time. The shadows in the trees, the whispers in the air, they were reminders of the truth. The tomb was not truly gone. The creature was not truly defeated. The world would always hold its secrets, its ancient terrors, waiting for the next unwitting soul to awaken them. Grant looked at the horizon, the mist curling around the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. They had survived. They had broken the curse, for now. But there would always be echoes. And in those echoes the tomb would never truly rest. Epilogue. As dawn broke over the horizon, the mist seemed to dissipate, but the memory of the tomb lingered. The team, their lives irreversibly changed, left the forest behind, unsure of where their future lay. They were free, but at what cost? The tomb might have been closed, but the shadows that followed them were not so easily left behind. And so, as time went on, their stories, their experiences, would become little more than a legend. A whispered tale of those who had uncovered something that should never have been found. They would never forget the terror, the pain, and the strange peace that had come in its wake. This, too, was part of the curse, a curse that could never truly be broken. This is a work of fiction and not based on real events. Any similarities to actual persons, living or dead, or real events are purely coincidental.